Ever wondered why your colors look like this? Yeah, me too. For the longest time, I've been asking the same question. Why are my colors so muddy? And over the years, I've learned these 3 tips that help me immensely when it comes to color. The first tip, ironically, isn't even about color. A lot of the times when we think about color, we think of it as the same thing as values. Values are basically the black and white / grayscale version of an image, and a lot of beginners like to just skip the value step and go straight to colors. Unfortunately, this is one of the biggest reasons why your colors might look like this. Ugh. You see, values are arguably the most important piece of the puzzle to any good drawing or painting. It's the foundation of an image, sort of like a freshly fried donut, and color is more like the icing and sprinkles on top. If the donut itself looks like this, then no matter how much fancy icing you add on top, it still won't look like something I want to bite into. Take a look at this image, for example. Let's convert it into grayscale first. In Clip Studio, the program I'm using here, and most other drawing software, you can create a new layer, fill it with black or any gray, and switch the layer blending mode to saturation. Put this at the top of your layer stack, and now you can turn the layer on and off to check your values. But in Photoshop, you can set a hotkey for this, which makes it very convenient when it comes to checking. You want to go to View and then Proof Setup, Custom, and from this drop-down bar, pick dot gain 10% and click Save. And then at your keyboard shortcuts, find Proof Colors at Application Menus and set whatever shortcut you want for it. I believe you can even color pick in this mode without picking the grays. Keep painting and it wouldn't affect anything. Now that's out of the way, let's go back to analyzing. This is a piece that I did years ago, and you can clearly see the typical muddy colors here on the character. When it comes to values, the first thing I would like to determine is the local color of each element in the piece. This is a fairly simple portrait sketch of Amelia Watson from Hololive, so there are only a handful of things with different local colors. We have the skin, the blonde hair, her beautiful blue eyes, the brown detective hat, red tie, and white shirt. Looking at the grayscale version of this, the value ranges of the hair, skin, and this shirt is way too similar. Plus, we have the white background as well. This is the reason why the piece looked muddy in terms of color. There was no clear separation between the different elements in terms of value. One way to fix this is by changing the lighting setup. Since we know the local color of the hair and the skin in this case is pretty similar in value thanks to her design, we should tweak the lighting to better emphasize their differences. Now, there are multiple ways that we can do this, but I'm feeling like a lighter value on her skin and a darker value on the hair, especially since we're going with this white background. This will create a sort of sandwich effect for better contrast and framing. I also did some stuff to the saturation of each color, but we'll come back to that later. Now that we separated the value ranges of each object, you can see how much of a difference it made. A lot of times we're stuck in thinking about elements in our drawings as just the local colors, when these colors can be tweaked largely depending on the environment and lighting conditions they're in. This opens up a whole nother can of worms when it comes to lighting and how it affects color. I might make another video explaining that in the future, but for now, let's move on. Now that we have a stronger base, we can finally do something more fun. It's time to add some icing, baby. Let's talk about accent colors and how to strategically use them to avoid having your pieces looking muddy. Accent colors are the highlights in a piece. They're usually smaller in proportion, highly saturated, and very eye-catching. And this is the point. Smaller in proportion. Now, in the case of this piece, there are several ways we can use accent colors to enhance it. The first and most obvious one is her beautiful blue eyes, which is a very common place to put your accent colors on. Think about the typical anime character you see. Their eyes are usually the focal point on the face, so it makes sense to put accent colors there to direct attention to it. In the original version, the reason why it looked muddy is because of these 3 areas: the hat, the entire hair, and the skin. These 3 areas, which were not the main focal point, all had very saturated and bright colors, as opposed to the eyes, which were fairly desaturated. This ended up making them competing with each other and took away focus from the focal point, which is supposed to be the eyes. Common mistake number one, the proportion between saturated and desaturated colors in this case is fairly balanced, which is also a bad thing in general because you want your accent colors to be relatively smaller in proportion compared to your base colors. So let's tweak those areas by desaturating them and think about our accent colors next. Okay, now there are a million ways to do this as long as you're being mindful of your values. You don't have to use just one color for your accents. In fact, most artists tend to use multiple highly saturated color hues as their accent. But remember, in very small doses. Another pretty general rule for accent colors is using complementary colors. In this case, we're using this light blue, which is directly opposite of the yellowish brown tone of the rest of the piece. Because of that, there's a particular area of the piece that I want to talk about here, the red tie. In the original version of this, the red that I used for the tie is pretty saturated. This is common mistake number two, because remember, the focal point here is the eyes. Putting a saturated eye-catching red all across the tie here will just end up competing against the blue eyes. Again, you don't want to get caught up thinking about things in just the local colors. So I opted for a desaturated version of the red here for the tie as well, keeping everything nice and focused. Which brings us to the next point. Another reason why your colors might look muddy is this, edges. This is a common issue as well when it comes to muddy colors. We tend to over blend things instead of keeping the edges sharp. This over focus on blending is going to create two problems for you. The image is going to look blurry and out of focus, but more importantly, we lose out on the separation between different elements in the scene, just like what we mentioned at the start of the video with values. One way you can mitigate this is just simply including line art, which I did not do in the original. And you can see how it helps here to just separate things a lot better. But this is obviously depending on your style, so just keep in mind that if you're going lineless, you want your edges to be razor sharp between two distinct elements, at least at the focal point areas. Another thing you should keep in mind is to avoid blending areas that have very different values or hue, like her jawline here in the original, which had two very different groups of value, but I blended the edge, resulting in this washed and rounded looking jaw. By just keeping the edge sharper, the face feels much more well defined and simplified, giving us a cleaner look. I'm also touching up other areas like the boundaries between the hat and the hair, the folds of the shirt here and the tie to make the whole piece sharper and more focused. Now, in terms of actually blending, negative areas like the shirt here and the blank part of the hat are all good places to actually do some blending. Remember, blending the area merges shapes and often makes it look out of focus. So you want to do it specifically in non-focal areas or when you want to simplify the shapes. I'll occasionally break apart edges like these by blurring them in the middle somewhere, you know, just to add some spice. But from here, it depends more on your personal style and aesthetic senses. Just don't overdo it, you know? Keep it subtle, keep it cool. So this is before applying those 3 tips and after. Obviously, there are a lot more nuances when it comes to color and light, so if there's anything you want me to cover in the future, please let me know down in the comments. And just before you go, click this. Bye! You want to do it specific? You want to do it obviously, there are more. Obviously, there are a lot more. Obviously, there are. All right. Ready? Obviously,